Armed conflict has been with us since the dawn of civilization. Archaeologists have unearthed evidence of armies as far back as 10,000 BC. Military history has always existed on a grand scale, with legendary battles fought on land, sea, and air. From ancient daggers to modern medals of honor, in expert hands, these relics reveal the stories of those who are no longer here to speak for themselves. Join us as we unlock the secrets of Militaria. Today on Militaria, we look at a uniform and military recruitment poster from World War II, a model set used for planning drills from the First World War, and a plaque from the British ship HMS Magpie. A grandson shows Gary his grandfather's uniform, as well as a Canadian recruitment poster from World War II.
I went up to the attic looking for Christmas decorations, and I couldn't find them. And I found what looked to be a suitcase out of the 40s.
Gary looks at a fascinating instructional tool developed by Captain Brinewood Potts.
You refer to it as a game, which of course makes me cringe.
I know.
Yeah, and you probably did that on purpose.
Jennifer examines a plaque that was crafted for the HMS Magpie, the four whose services were tragically cut short after just 2 months.
And both sides were armed, not only the police, but also the men who were running the rum. Rather hazardous occupation.
My name is Jonathan McKay, and I've been a paramedic for 23 years, mostly specializing in very remote places. So the items I brought in today are a recruiting poster that I was gifted, my grandfather's uniform he came home from the war in, and I also have a picture of my grandfather in his service uniform.
When Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, Canada's support of an Allied response was immediate, despite still recovering from the Great Depression and possessing a financially neglected military force. At the time, the Canadian Army was an assortment of 55,000 regular members and reservists, both of which had limited access to modern equipment. The Navy had only 13 ships. The Air Force had fewer than 30 planes. As a result, Canadian war efforts began modestly, initially committing 2 divisions, one for home defence and the other to fight overseas.
So John, welcome to Militaria, and I see you brought some wonderful artifacts with you, and I was wondering if you could just take a moment and tell us what you brought along.
Absolutely, Gary. Thank you for the opportunity. His name was Raymond Monroe, and from Pictou County, Nova Scotia. Well, these are his medals. He retired as a commissionaire, so I got these medals after he passed.
Let's talk about your grandfather's medals and what he was awarded. So the first medal there is a 1939 45 star, and that was awarded for 6 months of service in the campaign in the front lines. So he would have had to have left England, gone over to France to receive that medal and serve there for 6 months or be wounded or killed. So then the second medal is the France and Germany Star. So that's for the whole Northern Europe campaign. And they only had to serve for 30 days for that. Okay. The next is the Defense of England Medal. And that was for 6 months service in England. So if your grandfather was a reinforcement and had gone from Canada right into France, he would have skipped that and not received that. So obviously he spent some time in England before he went onto the continent. Prime Minister Mackenzie King during the Second World War really didn't want to enact conscription. However, he was forced to. So they enacted conscription in 1940, but the provision was that the men that were conscripted would not have to leave Canada. So they were used for a garrison duty on the East Coast, West Coast, that sort of thing, Erie Canal, any of these important places. However, as the war went on and after D-Day, they were having problems getting enough volunteers to join to make up the losses that were occurring. And they had tried with those soldiers that were conscripted to get them to volunteer to go overseas, but that didn't work very well either. The Prime Minister had, gone to the Army and said, get your generals and get, your commanders to convince these guys to volunteer to go overseas. And these people felt they were doing enough. They were at home doing their part, and they had no interest in going overseas. So Thus, there was a bit of animosity, well, probably not a bit, I'm probably understating it,
Yeah, I can
between
imagine.
those that were volunteered and those that had not. So it was quite important that when you got back, you wanted everyone to know that you were, in fact, a volunteer, as opposed to those, they referred to them as zombies, that were conscripted and were serving in Canada. So John, besides what we've spoken about so far with your grandfather, what else do you remember or know about him?
A lot and not much, I think. So he is my step-granddad, and but he was around since before I was born. He was just a good human being who would choose right over easy. I know he ended up leaving the police force at one point because he caught other officers in a something that compromised the force, and he chose to leave himself after everything went down. He didn't speak much about the war. He was quite proud. Like, I remember Remembrance Day, we'd see the medals, but he didn't speak much of the war. And it was only after I became a paramedic. And the reason I say that is I've experienced that many forces people will talk to me like I'm not fully civilian, and I am. I'm not claiming any, but I've had some sharing moments with veterans that have really touched me. And because of some of the strife that I've had to deal in my career, starting to realize the Grampy not talking very much was probably indicative of some of the stuff that he'd gone through.
Right.
And seeing at one point in his healthcare, seeing some of the scars from his wounds, know that he was pretty grievously injured at one point. I know at least 2 of his brothers served as well. One of them was killed in action.
Right, and so he probably could have been exempt, but felt that it was more important to serve.
He was a man of high moral standard. I mean, if
Right.
he put his money where his mouth is
Mhm.
my experience of him he was quite a formative person in my life.
Right, and so a lot of these people, that's exactly it. They felt it was more important to do their part, and seemed to be doing their part. And even though we needed food, we needed farms, and that sort of thing, but to be a fit young man, going downtown Pictou, the ladies wouldn't have looked twice at him because they would have thought he was a coward. So John, thank you so much for bringing these wonderful artifacts in. And so what are your plans with these artifacts? Because these are all things that would fit well in the Army Museum. However, I think I know the answer to that because your interest in them and your ties to your grandfather tell me that you want to keep this and you want to keep discovering more and then passing it on in your family, which I think is where it should be. Once again, thank you so much for bringing it in, and please take care of them. And I really hope that you get that service file, and then one day I get a phone call from you and you go, Gary, can't understand any of this. Give me a hand.
I look forward to that day, and it's my pleasure. I can't believe how much I learned today.
Great.
My grandfather, he was a huge influence on my life. I'm thinking a lot about that today because growing up, it was pretty apparent that he would choose doing the right thing over what was comfortable. Learning about the volunteer, he was always proud of being a volunteer, and I'm starting to understand what that meant. And I can only imagine what he would have felt, at the prospect of going to war, but yet he did it. And that is very much in line with the man that I knew and loved.
Coming up on Militaria.
They're quite rare, actually. I did find that there was someone who was requesting to see one in person because they're so rare. My name is Shara Kingston. I am the collections manager at the Army Museum Halifax Citadel. Today I brought in some drill models developed by Captain Brinewood Potts in around circa 1890.
Originated by the Romans, modern drill is a technique for soldiers to learn military fundamentals, promoting discipline, teamwork, pride, and professionalism. At its core, drill is marching and tactical maneuvering. Between the 17th and 20th centuries, cumbersome musket-driven combat dominated battlefields, and only precise coordination resulted in effective firing. By creating a controllable environment where soldiers could load and unload their weapons safely, drill allowed commanders to minimize the risk of friendly fire and become an indispensable survival skill. Today, drill is a measure of military competence, often demonstrated in parades and events where military representation is warranted. To the untrained eye, the marching is an entertaining spectacle, but to a war-trained eye, it reveals the skilled intricacies of readied forces.
So Shara, welcome to Militaria. Could you tell us what you brought in today?
Well, from the Army Museum, I have brought this great instructional military drill set, game, if you will, for some of us looking at it. It looks like a game that was designed by Captain Brinewood Potts.
This is a training aid for drill. I used it to lay out the parades because we've all seen the parades in Buckingham Palace and all those sort of things. And it always looks wonderful, but in order to look wonderful, they had to be planned, and everyone needs to know where they need to stand, what's happening, what things are moving, and that's where this comes in.
So when I came across this, I had no idea what I was looking at from the point of view of myself, not having been or served in the military. It looks like a game. It's in a box that pulls out, and there's a great number of pieces. It's colorful. I obviously understand that it's an instructional tool. I don't know how it works.
So, as you said, it comes all contained in one simple box. The top slides off. Inside are all of these little blocks that have different symbols on them. This was something that Captain Potts came up with and designed. Probably was involved in a parade or two that went, oh, you know, we need something that does a better job. And at the time, these didn't exist. And in your research, you found a couple of others that had been done, but this was supposedly the best one. So Captain Potts designed this in the 1860s. He was a captain in the Honorable Artillery Company, which is the oldest regiment in the British Army. Henry VIII was the one that organized it, and it's been in existence ever since. So Shara, in your research, were you able to find out much about Captain Potts?
First of all, his name is so unusual that I thought for sure I would put in Brinewood Potts and all of this information would come to me, but that was not the case. What I did find out was that he was the adjutant, as you said, with this unit from 1861 to 1866. Then he retired. And then I found a later piece of research which suggested that he went on to paint scenery for a theater that was being built in London, and that's all I found. So to me, it sort of made sense because I thought this is a very creative endeavor and definitely took some skill and some planning and thought, and even the box itself is well planned out and thought through, that he would go into set design and scenery as a retirement project. But there isn't a lot to find out about this young man.
So Shara, thank you so much for bringing this in and having the wisdom to pick such a beautiful artifact to bring from the Army Museum. What are the plans for it? Is it back into storage?
Well, when we pulled it out, and we had pulled it out prior to this, but when we pulled it out to bring to share, we started all marveling at it. We have some plans for it to be on display in the future with a new rollover for the winter. I will definitely have to do some triage to the key. The way it goes in here is it's folded into a little bundle to slide in, and so the distinction line marks have all started to rip. I mean, we're 1861, so it's going to happen. So I will most likely encapsulate this, which means we won't be able to fit it back in the box. We'll have to start separating them out. But the plan is to put them out on display in a place where no one can touch them, because I know if these were out on display, I would want to move the pieces.
So once again, thank you for bringing this in.
Thanks so much. So this artifact is interesting because it really shows the behind the scenes of military drill, and whether that be, as Gary suggested, drill for show for the sovereign or in that kind of capacity, or whether someone might be able to use that as a tactical drill. I think it's very cool. It's colorful, it's interesting, and it's well put together, but just showing that behind the scenes is very neat.
Coming up on Militaria.
In order to feed his family, pay his bills, he decided, like hundreds of other fishermen, to get into rum running. My name is Tom Pelshaw. Currently, I'm employed as a member of the Corps of Commissionaires in Canada.
The HMS Magpie was a British schooner launched in Jamaica during the summer of 1826. The ship patrolled for pirate and slave ships and protected British interests around the Caribbean. After only 2 months at sea, she capsized off the coast of Cuba. 35 men were on board. Exact details of the event are preserved in written accounts, including an inquiry court-martialed by the British Admiralty. These records tell of harrowing conditions faced by crew members and the heroic actions taken by their young captain, Lieutenant Edward Smith, who perished after desperate, though remarkably composed attempts to save his men. Only 2 survivors emerged from the wreckage. Smith would be recognised posthumously for his bravery by the British Admiralty.
Hi, Tom. Welcome to Militaria. What have you brought us today?
What I have here is a plaque. The gentleman who owned it was supporting his family during the Great Depression, and unfortunately the fishing industry was down, so to support them he became a rum runner, and his runs would go from Caribbean to Lunenburg and back, and of course he'd be bringing in all kinds of interesting alcohol to Nova Scotia during the Great Depression.
So, Tom, what is unique about the 2 birds here on the front of this carving? Could you explain that to us a little bit?
Yes, I looked at it and I thought to myself, they're magpies. They're not hawks, they're not eagles, but magpies? I thought that was rather unusual. Not only was it carved with the magpies, there are certain parts to the plaque that point towards Jamaica. This is a pineapple up here, and these here, you would think on any other British plaque, you might have olive branches. These are actually banana leaves. And then you have a single star under the magpie. And as you know, a single star signifies the rank of a commander of a ship. The magpies themselves are rather unique in that if you look in their eyes, they're very serious looking. And in their talons, each one of them has a talon wrapped around it, what it signifies a cannonade or a cannonball, hence again, a warship.
So, Tom, how was this piece found and acquired?
It's hard to imagine the kind of power behind a storm. A squall, which is like a miniature hurricane, would take the ship and whipped it all over the place. And because it was a sloop, it wasn't, if you had ships that align like the HMS Victory, they had tons and tons and tons of iron cannonball in their ballast, and they would sink to the bottom. Contrary to that, because it was not heavily weighted, it might have had a ton of cannonballs on it, it stayed afloat, but it was whipped around, it was partially sinking, and it was pushed ashore. And of course, you have people who make a living walking down the beach, and in that part of the world, with all the ship fare, you would occasionally come across a wreck of a ship. Now, there was a gentleman or a lady walking along the shore one day, and they saw the wreck of the HMS Victory, and not really even being sure what it was, the gentleman walked up, saw this plaque, and he couldn't just take it, he had to cut it out. So they grabbed an axe, and they literally, you could see the marks here where they had chopped it to remove it from its housing. And that's how it was found.
It's kind of a sad tale with HMS Magpie. I mean, she was commissioned in 1826, and then with only 2 months of being in service, that squall hit the sloop, and that was it. And unfortunate as well is the story of the commander of HMCS Magpie, Lieutenant Edward Smith, and his sad ending. Do you want to tell us a bit about Lieutenant Edward Smith and his final end?
I'd love to. An inquiry was held by the British Admiralty. They had the 2 survivors at this board of inquiry, and when they started to give their testimony, they started to cry because they were so taken with the heroism displayed by Lieutenant Smith, in that rather than have his men jump overboard in what was a sea of sharks, he jumped in the water himself and he guided his men. And the most intriguing part was this officer commanded his men and instructed them while he was being eaten by sharks. He never panicked, never raised his voice. And finally, one came by, bit his legs off, and he was dragged slowly to the bottom. He never showed any emotion other than being an officer of the Royal Navy.
Tom, coming from a military family, does this artifact have even more significance and meaning to you personally?
The intriguing thing about this is I purchased it from an online source, and there was no indication of size. There was just the photograph. So I thought I was picking up a board that was maybe a foot by 14 inches. So I was really surprised at what I came across. But it has such a strong military presence. I mean, it looks like something you would see on a crest. And of course, having a military background, that appealed to me.
Tom, you had mentioned that the original owner of this plaque was a rum runner. Do you want to tell us a little bit about him?
Yes, by all means. This young lady, she was a little girl, and she knew that her grandfather, who was a fisherman, was doing something a little different now because he couldn't support his family. The fish market, fish stocks were down. So in order to feed his family, pay his bills, he decided, like hundreds of other fishermen along the coast of Nova Scotia, to get into rum running. This involved taking his boat to the Caribbean. It could be St. Lucia, it could be Haiti or Jamaica, and picking up kegs of rum and bringing them back to little outports in Nova Scotia where they would be transported and sold. It was hazardous, and there would be literally dozens of police along the shore just waiting for these men to come in with their boats, and of course they'd be arrested and the alcohol confiscated. It was a very dangerous profession, and both sides were armed, not only the police, but also the men who were running the rum. So sometimes there would be pitched battles as the police tried to arrest them. Rather hazardous occupation.
Tom, thank you so much for coming today and bringing this beautiful artifact with you. What are your future plans for this?
Well, I'm certainly not going to say that I'm going to cut it up and use it for firewood, that's for sure. No, actually, I spent a long time researching this, and I would like to think that eventually it's going to find its way into a museum. For the time being, I'm going to keep it. However, if someone were to come along, a gentleman who's serious about maritime or nautical antiques, were interested in purchasing, I might consider that.
Well, Tom, thank you so much for bringing this beautiful artifact from HMS Magpie. It had such a wonderful story, and really appreciate that you shared that with us today.
Thank you very much, and it was really nice to have your input as far as letting me know things that I had not, in months and months of research, been able to find out. Thank you kindly for your research.
Oh, you're welcome.
Jennifer, thank you.
What I find really interesting about artifacts like this piece from the Magpie is that an artifact isn't just an artifact because it was made 200 years ago, or particularly who owned it. It really, you have to kind of look beyond that. You have to look about the symbolism within the artifact and what it means and what it's representing. So often, unsimilarly normal objects in our everyday lives might speak to a bigger history and story that we don't even know about. And that's what's great about this piece from the Magpie. It really speaks to the time, the period, and what was really going on in the Caribbean.